I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw Patricia standing in my backyard with a clipboard, gesturing wildly at what looked like a brand new wooden shed sitting awkwardly close to the property line between our yards. My name is Trevor Norris, and I had just bought this beautiful colonial home in Asheville, North Carolina 6 months ago. The neighborhood, Mountain View Estates, seemed perfect when I moved in. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and reasonable HOA fees. What I didn't know was that Patricia Henderson, the HOA president, lived right next door and had very specific ideas about how everyone should live their lives. I stepped out of my truck and walked toward her, already feeling my blood pressure rising. Patricia was 52 years old, with that particular haircut that seemed mandatory for women in positions of petty power. You know the one, short and aggressively styled with too much hairspray. She wore a pantsuit despite it being a Saturday afternoon and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Trevor, excellent timing," she called out, not looking up from her clipboard. "I wanted to inform you about the new storage shed I've had installed. As HOA president, I've ensured it meets all community standards." I walked closer and felt my stomach drop. The shed wasn't just near the property line, it was clearly over it. At least 2 feet of the structure sat on what I was pretty sure was my property. "Patricia, that shed looks like it's on my land," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. She finally looked up, her expression the perfect mixture of condescension and dismissal. "Don't be ridiculous. I had my contractor measure everything precisely. This is entirely on my property." "I really don't think so," I replied, walking along the line where I knew the boundary should be. The previous owner had pointed it out when I bought the place. There was an old fence post that marked the corner, and the line ran straight back from there. The shed was definitely over. Patricia's face hardened. "Are you questioning my judgment? I've been the HOA president for 7 years. I think I know where property lines are in this community." "That doesn't mean you know where mine specifically is," I said, trying to remain calm. "Look, I'm not trying to start a fight, but I'm pretty sure that's my land. Maybe we should get a surveyor out here to confirm." "A surveyor?" she laughed, a sharp sound that held no humor. "That's completely unnecessary and a waste of money. The shed stays where it is." I took a deep breath. "Patricia, if that shed is on my property, it needs to be moved. I'm asking nicely. And I'm telling you, as HOA president, that everything is in order. This conversation is over." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, leaving me standing there, staring at the shed that was absolutely, without question, sitting on my land. That evening, I called my real estate agent, Marcus, who had helped me buy the house. He was a straight shooter who had lived in Asheville his whole life and knew the area well. "Marcus, it's Trevor. I've got a situation with my neighbor. Let me guess, Patricia Henderson," he sighed audibly. "What did she do now? You know her." "Everyone in the real estate business knows Patricia. She's been a thorn in the side of half the agents in this city." "What happened?" I explained the shed situation, and Marcus let out a low whistle. "Yeah, you're going to need a survey. I actually have the survey from when you bought the place. Let me dig it up and send it over. But if you're serious about this, get a new survey done. It'll hold up better if this goes to court." "Court? You think it'll go that far with Patricia?" "Probably. She doesn't back down from anything, ever. I sold a house 3 streets over last year, and she tried to find the new owners for parking their car in their own driveway overnight. Said it violated some obscure HOA rule she'd invented. They had to hire a lawyer. After hanging up with Marcus, I spent the evening researching property surveyors in the Asheville area. I found a well-reviewed company called Blue Ridge Land Surveying and called first thing Monday morning. The receptionist was friendly and efficient. "We can have someone out there Thursday afternoon." "Will that work?" "Perfect," I said, giving her my address. "Just so you know, the surveyor will need access to the entire property boundary. Make sure any obstacles are cleared if possible." "The obstacle is the problem," I muttered, but scheduled the appointment. Tuesday evening, I drafted a formal letter to Patricia, keeping it professional and polite. I explained that I had scheduled a survey for Thursday and that I would be happy to share the results with her. I hand-delivered it to her mailbox, hoping this could still be resolved amicably. Wednesday morning, I found a violation notice from the HOA taped to my front door. According to Patricia, my grass was a quarter-inch too long, and I had 24 hours to remedy the situation or face a $50 fine. I measured my grass. It was well within the acceptable range stated in the HOA bylaws. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I mowed anyway, cutting it shorter than necessary. I wasn't going to give her any legitimate ammunition. Thursday arrived with perfect weather, sunny and mild. The surveyor, a man named George Pittman, showed up right on time at 2 o'clock. He was in his late 50s, with sun-weathered skin and the efficient manner of someone who had done this job 1,000 times. "You're the one with the neighbor dispute?" he asked, pulling equipment from his truck. "That obvious?" "It's about 70% of my business these days," he said with a slight smile. "Everyone wants to build right up to the property line, and nobody wants to pay for a survey until there's a problem." I showed him the shed and explained the situation. He nodded, unsurprised, and got to work. Using a combination of GPS equipment, historical records, and physical markers, he began establishing the exact boundary line. Patricia emerged from her house about 20 minutes into the survey. She was dressed in another pantsuit, this one navy blue, and she approached with her phone held up, recording. "Excuse me, what are you doing on HOA property?" she demanded. George didn't even look up from his equipment. "I'm surveying the property line between 142 and 144 Oakmont Drive." "I have permission from the owner of 142. This is completely unnecessary harassment," Patricia said, moving closer to me. "I'm documenting this entire fiasco, Trevor. This will be brought up at the next HOA meeting." "That's fine," I replied evenly. "I'm just establishing where my property line is. That's my right as a homeowner." "You're wasting everyone's time and creating problems where none exist." George straightened up and walked over to us. "Madam, I'll need you to step back. You're interfering with my work." "I'm the HOA president, and I have every right to observe what's happening in my community." "You can observe from over there," George said, pointing to her driveway. His tone was polite but firm. "But you can't interfere with a legal survey." Patricia's face flushed red, but she retreated to her property, though she kept her phone up, recording everything. The survey took about 3 hours. George was meticulous, placing small flags along the boundary line as he went. Each flag made Patricia's situation worse. The shed wasn't just slightly over the line. It was significantly over it. A full third of the structure sat on my property. As George packed up his equipment, he handed me a preliminary sketch. "I'll have the official report ready by Monday, but I can tell you right now that shed is definitely on your land. About 3 feet over at the deepest point." 3 feet. I stared at the sketch. "How did her contractor get it that wrong?" George shrugged. "Either they didn't bother to check, or your neighbor told them not to worry about it. Happens more than you'd think. People assume they know where their property ends." "What are my options?" "Well, legally, you can require her to remove any structure on your property. You've got clear rights here. I'd recommend sending her a certified copy of the survey once it's complete, and giving her a reasonable deadline to move or remove the shed. If she doesn't comply, you can take it to civil court. Patricia was standing in her driveway, arms crossed, as George drove away. I walked over to the property line, looking at the flags fluttering in the breeze. "The survey will prove I'm right," Patricia called out. "And then you'll owe me an apology and reimbursement for wasting my time." "Patricia, I can see the flags. The shed is on my property." "Those flags are wrong. That surveyor doesn't know what he's doing. He's been doing this for 30 years. The flags aren't wrong." She stormed into her house, slamming the door hard enough that I heard it from where I stood. Friday morning brought another HOA violation notice. This time, I was being cited for creating a disturbance in the community and for unauthorized surveying activities. The fine was $100. I took photos of both notices and called a real estate attorney that Marcus had recommended. Her name was Jennifer Carlisle, and her office was in downtown Asheville. She agreed to see me that afternoon. Jennifer's office was in a renovated brick building near Pack Square. She was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had dealt with plenty of HOA disputes. I laid out the entire situation, showing her the violation notices, my survey appointment confirmation, and the preliminary sketch from George. She examined everything carefully, then sat back in her chair. "Okay, this is pretty straightforward. First, these HOA violations are bogus. You have every legal right to survey your property and you haven't created any disturbance. Don't pay these fines. Second, once you have the official survey, you'll send a demand letter requiring the removal of the shed. We'll give her 30 days, which is more than reasonable. What if she refuses? Then we file a civil suit for trespass and property encroachment. It's an open and shut case if the survey is accurate, and from what you're describing, it is. She'll be ordered to remove the shed and will likely have to pay your legal fees and survey costs. She's going to make my life hell in the meantime," I said. Jennifer smiled slightly. "Probably. But every bogus violation notice she issues is documentation of harassment. Keep everything. Every email, every letter, every fine notice. It all helps your case if we need to pursue further action." I left her office feeling better, at least having a plan. The weekend passed quietly, though I noticed Patricia watching my house frequently, always with her phone out. Monday morning, the official survey arrived via email. George had done an incredibly thorough job. The report included historical property records, GPS coordinates, photographs, and a detailed map showing the exact boundary line. The shed encroached on my property by a maximum of 3 feet 2 inches. I forwarded it to Jennifer immediately. She called me an hour later. "This is perfect. I'm drafting the demand letter now. We'll send it certified mail so there's proof of receipt. The letter will give her 30 days from receipt to remove the shed entirely from your property. What if she claims she can't afford to move it? That's not your problem. She built it. She's responsible for the cost of fixing her mistake. The law is clear on this." The demand letter went out Tuesday. Patricia received it Thursday, and I know this because she showed up at my door at 7 in the morning Friday, screaming, "How dare you!" She shouted when I opened the door. "You're trying to bully me with lawyers and fake surveys. This is harassment. Patricia, the survey is legitimate. Your shed is on my property. I'm asking you to move it." "I'm not moving anything. That shed cost me $4,000 and it stays right where it is. Then you built a $4,000 shed partially on someone else's land. That's not my fault. This is going to the HOA board. I'm calling an emergency meeting. Everyone in this community will know what kind of person you are." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "I have all the documentation I need." She continued yelling, but I closed the door. Through the window, I watched her storm back to her house, already on her phone. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, held at the community clubhouse. I arrived 15 minutes early with Jennifer, who had agreed to accompany me. The clubhouse was a modest building at the entrance to the neighborhood, with a meeting room that could hold about 50 people. About 20 residents were already there, talking in small groups. The energy was tense. Patricia sat at the front table with the other board members. Richard Moss, the vice president, and Susan Young, the secretary. All three were watching me with undisguised hostility as I entered. Jennifer and I took seats in the middle row. A few residents nodded at me. One older man, maybe 70, leaned over. "You're the one with the property dispute," he whispered. "That's me. Good luck. Patricia doesn't lose gracefully." The meeting started promptly at 7. Patricia called it to order with her gavel, then launched immediately into her prepared statement. "We're here tonight because of a serious situation involving one of our residents. Trevor Norris has made false accusations about property boundaries and has attempted to force me, your HOA president, to remove a properly permitted and constructed storage shed. This is a clear case of harassment and bullying, and the board takes it very seriously." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jennifer stood up. "May I speak?" she asked. Patricia's expression turned even more sour. "And you are Jennifer Carlisle, attorney representing Mr. Norris. I'd like to present the facts of this case to the assembled residents." "This isn't a courtroom, Miss Carlisle. You don't just get to speak." "Actually," Richard interjected, looking uncomfortable, "the bylaws say any resident can speak during an open meeting. I think we should hear what she has to say." Patricia shot him a furious look, but gestured stiffly for Jennifer to continue. Jennifer walked to the front, pulling out copies of the survey report. "I have here an official survey conducted by Blue Ridge Land Surveying, a licensed and bonded surveying company. This survey clearly shows that Mrs. Henderson's shed encroaches on Mr. Norris's property by up to 3 feet. I'm happy to provide copies to anyone who wants to see it." Several hands went up immediately. Jennifer distributed copies while Patricia sat fuming. "This is a biased survey commissioned by Mr. Norris," Patricia said. "Of course it says what he paid it to say." "Surveys don't work that way," Jennifer replied calmly. "Surveyors are licensed professionals who can lose their certification for falsifying reports. The survey uses GPS coordinates, historical records, and physical markers. It's objective fact." The older man who had spoken to me earlier raised his hand. "Patricia, did you have a survey done before you built the shed?" "I didn't need one. I know where my property line is." "But you didn't verify it professionally," he pressed. "I've lived here for 15 years. I know my own property." Susan, the secretary, spoke up quietly. "Patricia, if the survey shows the shed is over the line, shouldn't you move it?" "The survey is wrong," Patricia insisted, her voice rising. "This is a setup. Trevor moved in 6 months ago and has been looking for ways to cause problems ever since." "That's not true," I said, standing up. "I've followed every HOA rule. I've been a good neighbor. I only had the survey done because your shed appeared on what I believed was my property. The survey confirmed I was right. I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want my property respected." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "I'm confused. If the survey is official and legitimate, why is this even a debate? Shouldn't Patricia just move the shed?" "Because it's an expensive fix for what might be a mistake," Richard said slowly. He looked at Patricia. "Patricia, what if you're wrong? What if the survey is accurate?" "It's not," she said flatly. Jennifer spoke again. "Mrs. Henderson, would you be willing to commission your own survey?" If it shows the shed is entirely on your property, Mr. Norris will drop the matter." The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Patricia. "I'm not wasting money on an unnecessary survey," she said. "Why not?" the older man asked. "If you're so sure you're right, a survey would prove it." Patricia's face had gone from red to almost purple. "This meeting is over. The board will take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling." "The board doesn't have authority over property boundaries," Jennifer said. "This is a legal matter between property owners. The HOA isn't involved except that Mrs. Henderson happens to be the president." Patricia stood up abruptly, gathering her papers. "This meeting is adjourned." She walked out, leaving Richard and Susan sitting at the table, looking uncomfortable. After the meeting, several residents approached me. The older man introduced himself as Frank Morrison. "I've lived here for 22 years, he said, shaking my hand. "Patricia has gotten worse every year. She's needed someone to stand up to her for a long time. I'm not trying to be confrontational," I said. "I just want what's mine." "I know. But sometimes standing up for yourself is confrontational to people who are used to getting their way." He handed me a business card. "I'm retired now, but I practiced law for 40 years. If you need any advice, give me a call." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia ramped up her harassment campaign. I received violation notices for everything imaginable. My house number wasn't reflective enough. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My trash cans were visible from the street for 14 minutes after trash pickup. Each violation came with a $50 to $100 fine. I documented everything and didn't pay any of the fines. Jennifer sent a cease and desist letter to Patricia, warning her that the harassment needed to stop. It made no difference. The 30-day deadline for moving the shed came and went. Patricia did nothing. Jennifer filed a civil lawsuit in Buncombe County Superior Court, seeking an order to remove the shed, reimbursement for survey and legal costs, and compensation for harassment. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, life in the neighborhood became increasingly uncomfortable. Patricia had clearly been talking to other residents, trying to paint me as the villain. About half the neighborhood seemed to believe her version of events, while the other half either supported me or wanted to stay out of it entirely. My direct neighbors on the other side, a young couple named David and Rachel, were firmly in my corner. "We've had our own issues with Patricia," Rachel told me one evening when she stopped by. "She tried to fine us for having playground equipment in our backyard, said it was visually displeasing." "Our backyard, where nobody can even see it. How did you handle it?" We filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. Richard actually sided with us. Patricia was outvoted. She didn't speak to us for 6 months. The weeks crawled by. I continued receiving bogus violation notices, though they slowed down after Jennifer sent a second, more strongly worded cease and desist letter, specifically mentioning that the harassment was being documented for potential additional legal action. Finally, the court date arrived. It was a Wednesday morning in late September. The weather had turned cooler, with fall colors starting to show in the mountains around Asheville. Jennifer and I arrived at the courthouse early. Patricia showed up with her own attorney, a man named Douglas Ferraro who looked expensive in his tailored suit. George Pittman, the surveyor, was there as well, ready to testify. The case was heard by Judge Martha Brennan, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. Jennifer presented our case first. She laid out the timeline clearly. My purchase of the property, Patricia's shed construction, my discovery of the encroachment, the survey, the demand letter, and Patricia's refusal to comply. She entered the survey report as evidence, along with all the correspondence and bogus violation notices. Your Honor, this is a straightforward property encroachment case, Jennifer said. The survey clearly shows the defendant's structure is on my client's property. Mr. Norris has been more than reasonable, giving Mrs. Henderson 30 days to remedy the situation. She has refused and has instead engaged in a campaign of harassment against my client. Douglas Ferraro stood to present Patricia's defense. Your Honor, my client disputes the accuracy of the survey commissioned by the plaintiff. Mrs. Henderson has been a respected member of her community for 15 years and has every reason to know where her property boundaries are. The shed was constructed in good faith, based on her understanding of those boundaries. Does your client have a survey of her own to present? Judge Brennan asked. No, Your Honor. The expense of a survey was considered unnecessary. The judge raised an eyebrow. So your defense is that your client's personal opinion of where the property line is should override a professional survey? No, Your Honor. We're questioning the accuracy of the plaintiff's survey. On what grounds? Douglas hesitated. On the grounds that it contradicts my client's understanding of the property boundaries. Judge Brennan looked unimpressed. Mr. Ferraro, do you have any actual evidence that the survey is inaccurate? Expert testimony? An alternative survey? Anything concrete? We believe the surveyor may have been biased in favor of the plaintiff. Jennifer stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to call George Pittman to the stand. The judge nodded, and George was sworn in. Jennifer walked him through his credentials, which were impressive. 32 years of experience, hundreds of surveys conducted in Buncombe County, never had a survey successfully challenged in court. Mr. Pittman, can you explain how you conducted the survey of the properties at 142 and 144 Oakmont Drive? George explained the process in detail. He had used historical deed records, GPS technology, and physical markers. He had verified his work multiple times. The results were unambiguous. Is there any possibility that your survey is inaccurate? Jennifer asked. There's always a margin of error in any measurement, but in this case, it's plus or minus 6 inches at most. The shed is over the property line by 3 feet. There's no margin of error that would change that fact. Were you biased in favor of Mr. Norris? No. I've never met him before this survey. I have no relationship with him. I surveyed the property accurately according to professional standards. That's my job. Douglas cross-examined George, but he had nothing to work with. George's credentials were solid, his methods were standard, and he had no reason to lie. Patricia was called to testify next. She took the stand looking confident, but that confidence started to crumble under Jennifer's questioning. Mrs. Henderson, you stated that you knew where your property boundary was. What did you base that knowledge on? I've lived there for 15 years. I know my property. But did you ever have it professionally surveyed? No. Did you check any official records before building the shed? I didn't need to. I know where my property ends. So you built a $4,000 structure based entirely on your own assumption about where the property line was. It wasn't an assumption. I know my property. Mrs. Henderson, do you have any professional credentials in surveying or land measurement? No. Any training in how to accurately determine property boundaries? No, but I don't need training to know my own property. Jennifer paused, letting that hang in the air. Mrs. Henderson, after Mr. Norris received the survey showing your shed was on his property, why didn't you get your own survey to verify? Because it would have been a waste of money. I already knew the survey was wrong. How could you know that without checking? Patricia's composure finally cracked. Because I didn't want to believe I'd made a mistake. Is that what you want to hear? I built that shed exactly where I wanted it, and I'm not moving it just because some survey says I should. The courtroom went silent. Even Douglas looked stunned. Judge Brennan leaned forward. "Mrs. Henderson, are you saying you knowingly built the shed on your neighbor's property?" Patricia seemed to realize what she'd said. "No, I meant that I built it where I thought it should go, on my property. But the damage was done." Judge Brennan looked at the survey report again, then at Patricia. "I've heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, specifically the professional survey conducted by Mr. Pittman, I find that the shed at 144 Oakmont Drive does indeed encroach on the property at 142 Oakmont Drive. Mrs. Henderson is hereby ordered to remove the shed or the portion of the shed that sits on Mr. Norris's property within 30 days. "Your Honor, that's not fair," Patricia burst out. "Mrs. Henderson, you will let me finish. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay Mr. Norris's survey costs and reasonable attorney fees. The harassment documented in this case is troubling. The violation notices issued to Mr. Norris appear retaliatory and baseless. If Mr. Norris chooses to pursue a separate harassment claim, this court would look favorably on such an action." Douglas was whispering urgently to Patricia, who looked like she might explode. "The amount of survey and legal fees will be determined after both parties submit their documented costs. This court is adjourned." Judge Brennan stood and left the courtroom. Jennifer and I walked out into the hallway. I felt like I should be more triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired. "What happens now?" I asked. "We submit our costs. The court will review and approve them, and Patricia will have to pay. She also has 30 days to deal with the shed. If she doesn't comply, we go back to court and she'll face contempt charges." Patricia stormed past us, Douglas hurrying to keep up with her. She shot me a look of pure hatred but didn't say anything. Over the next week, things in the neighborhood were tense. Word of the court ruling spread quickly. Frank Morrison stopped by to congratulate me. Rachel and David brought over a bottle of wine to celebrate. But I also noticed some neighbors who had been friendly before now avoided eye contact when they saw me. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I came home from work to find Patricia and a contractor crew dismantling the shed. She was directing them with sharp, angry gestures. The contractor, a patient-looking man in his 50s, was clearly dealing with a difficult client. I watched from my driveway as they worked. It took about 4 hours to completely disassemble the shed. Patricia had them rebuild it entirely on her property, this time clearly within her boundary lines. The cost, I later learned from Rachel, who heard it from another neighbor, was nearly $3,000. That, combined with the survey and legal fees she had to pay me, meant Patricia's shed ended up costing her well over $8,000. The court awarded me $2,800 for the survey and initial legal fees. Jennifer had kept her costs reasonable, knowing I wasn't wealthy. Patricia paid within the required time frame, though she did it through her attorney, avoiding any direct contact with me. The harassment stopped immediately after the court ruling. No more bogus violation notices. No more aggressive patrols past my house. Patricia essentially pretended I didn't exist, which was fine with me. About a month after the shed was moved, Frank Morrison called and asked if I wanted to get coffee. We met at a local cafe downtown, and he had interesting news. "There's a recall petition going around," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "A group of residents want to remove Patricia as HOA president." "Really?" "Your case opened a lot of eyes. People started comparing notes about her behavior. Turns out you weren't the only one getting harassed. There are at least 8 other residents with complaints. Everything from bogus fines to selective enforcement of rules depending on whether she likes you." "Will the recall work?" "It has a good chance. We need signatures from 60% of the homeowners to force a special election. We're almost there, he smiled. You don't have to be involved if you don't want to be, but I thought you'd want to know. I appreciate that. Honestly, I just want to live peacefully in my house. I understand, but what you did standing up to her, it mattered. A lot of people were too afraid or too tired to fight back. 3 weeks later, the recall petition succeeded. A special election was held, and Patricia was removed as HOA president by a vote of 72 to 18. Richard took over as interim president and immediately started working on reforming how the HOA operated. One of his first actions was to establish a formal appeals process for violation notices. Another was to require that any fine over $50 had to be approved by the full board, not just the president. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they created accountability that hadn't existed before. Patricia remained in the neighborhood, but her power was broken. I'd occasionally see her in her backyard, but we never spoke. The shed sat squarely on her property, a constant reminder of the consequences of arrogance and overreach. Life gradually returned to normal. I became friends with several neighbors who had supported me or who came forward after the recall to share their own stories about Patricia. The neighborhood felt different, more genuinely friendly and less fearful. One evening in late November, I was raking leaves in my front yard when a car pulled up. An older woman I didn't recognize got out and approached me. "Are you Trevor Norris?" she asked. "I am. My name is Helen Park. My daughter is looking at buying a house 3 streets over. I heard about what happened with you and Patricia Henderson. I wanted to hear the story from you directly before my daughter makes an offer." I told her the whole story, from the shed appearing to the court case to Patricia's removal as HOA president. Helen listened carefully, asking occasional questions. When I finished, she smiled. "Thank you for being honest. You know what? I'm going to tell my daughter this is a good neighborhood, not because you didn't have a problem, but because you stood up for yourself and the community supported you. That says a lot about the kind of place this is." Her daughter bought the house. At the closing, according to the real estate agent, she specifically mentioned my story as one of the reasons she felt good about the neighborhood. Winter came to Asheville, bringing snow to the mountains and cold, crisp air to the valleys. I decorated my house for Christmas, putting up lights that were tasteful and followed all the HOA guidelines. I'd learned to appreciate clear rules, fairly enforced. On Christmas Eve, I found a card in my mailbox. It was from Frank Morrison and about a dozen other neighbors, thanking me for standing up to Patricia and wishing me a happy holiday. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. The shed incident became something of a legend in Mountain View Estates. New residents would hear the story, usually slightly embellished with each retelling. I became known as the guy who took on the HOA president and won. It wasn't how I'd wanted to be known, but there were worse reputations to have. Patricia listed her house for sale in March. The real estate gossip, courtesy of Marcus, was that she couldn't stand living in the neighborhood anymore after being removed as president. Her house sold quickly to a young family with 2 kids who seemed nice, and notably, were very careful about where they placed their swing set in the backyard. The day Patricia moved out, I happened to be working in my garage. I saw the moving truck pull away, followed by her car. She didn't look in my direction, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the neighborhood she'd lived in for 15 years. She just drove away. I felt a strange mix of emotions watching her go. I hadn't wanted to be her enemy. I just wanted to protect my property rights. But sometimes standing up for yourself means making enemies with people who see any boundary as a challenge to their authority. Richard proved to be an excellent HOA president. He was reasonable, fair, and actually interested in building community rather than enforcing petty rules. Under his leadership, the neighborhood organized a summer barbecue, a fall festival, and a holiday lights competition. Things Patricia would have seen as frivolous distractions from her rule enforcement mission. The surveying flags eventually disintegrated in the weather, but I didn't need them anymore. I knew exactly where my property line was, down to the inch. I'd paid enough to establish it. 1 year after the shed incident, I was sitting on my back deck on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading the paper. It was May, and the mountains were green and beautiful. Birds sang in the trees. My grass was exactly the right length according to HOA guidelines, not because I was afraid of Patricia anymore, but because I actually did like a well-maintained lawn. Rachel came over from next door, her toddler on her hip. "Morning, Trevor. We're doing a barbecue this afternoon if you want to come over. Just a few neighbors." "I'd like that," I said. As she walked back to her house, I thought about how much had changed in 1 year. I'd bought a house in what seemed like a perfect neighborhood, discovered it was controlled by a petty tyrant, stood up for my rights, and watched as the community transformed itself into something better. The shed was gone from my property. Patricia was gone from the neighborhood. The harassment was gone from my life. What remained was a house I loved in a community I was genuinely happy to be part of. Sometimes the hardest thing about standing up for yourself isn't the confrontation itself. It's making the decision that your boundaries matter, that your rights are worth defending, that you won't be pushed around just because someone else is louder or more aggressive, or has a title that makes them feel powerful. I'd made that decision when I called the surveyor. Everything else had followed from that one choice to establish, clearly and professionally, where my property ended and Patricia's began. It was a literal boundary, marked with GPS coordinates and legal documents. But it was also a metaphor for the kind of boundaries everyone needs to set in life. The surveyor's report sat in a file in my office, official and final. I'd never needed to look at it again after the court case. The truth it contained had been acknowledged, legally recognized, and enforced. Patricia had paid to remove her shed from my property, paid my costs, and paid the price of her own arrogance. Justice, I'd learned, doesn't always come easily. Sometimes you have to fight for it, document it, hire professionals to establish it, and stand firm when people try to bully you out of it. But when it comes, when a judge looks at the facts and rules in your favor, when a community sees the truth and supports you, it's worth every difficulty along the way. I finished my coffee and went inside to clean up before the barbecue. Life in Mountain View Estates continued, better than before, because one person built a shed where it didn't belong, and another person refused to accept that it could stay there. Sometimes the smallest disputes can lead to the biggest changes, and sometimes standing up for 3 feet of property line means standing up for something much larger. The shed incident was over, but its lessons remained. Know your boundaries. Defend your rights. Stand up to bullies, even when they have titles and authority. Document everything. Get professional help when you need it, and never, ever build anything without getting a proper survey first. That last lesson seemed particularly important for anyone dealing with property lines. Patricia had learned it the expensive way. I hoped others in the neighborhood, and maybe people hearing the story secondhand, would learn it the easy way by listening to what had happened. As I locked my door and headed to the barbecue that afternoon, I passed the spot where Patricia's shed had sat, partially on my property. The grass had grown back completely. You couldn't tell anything had ever been there. Nature, I thought, has a way of healing over disputes. The trick is making sure the healing happens after justice is done, not instead of it. The barbecue was fun and relaxed. Nobody mentioned Patricia or the shed. We talked about normal things like work and kids and the upcoming summer. I belonged here now, not as the new guy who'd had a problem, but as a real member of the community who'd helped make it better. And somewhere in Asheville, in a different neighborhood, Patricia was learning to live without the power she'd abused for so long. I didn't wish her harm. I just wished she'd learned the lesson that everyone else seemed to understand naturally. Your rights end where your neighbors begin, whether we're talking about property lines, HOA authority, or basic human decency. The shed was gone. The tyrant was gone. Justice had been served. And I was home, in every sense of the word, in a neighborhood that had become exactly what I'd hoped for when I first bought the house. Sometimes things work out the way they should, especially when you're willing to stand up and fight for what's right, no matter how much easier it would be to just let it go. I stayed at the barbecue until evening, talking and laughing with neighbors who'd become friends. When I finally walked home as the sun set behind the mountains, I felt genuinely content. This was my place. This was my community. And every inch of my property, clearly established by George Pittman and legally confirmed by Judge Brennan, was mine. The story of HOA Karen and the shed that crossed the property line was complete. The surveyor had testified. Patricia had paid to remove it. Justice had been served. And life, as it has a way of doing, had moved on to better things. But I would never forget the lesson. Sometimes the smallest encroachment requires the strongest defense, and standing up for your rights, no matter how difficult, is always worth it in the end.